In 1982, a man was alone in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. His boat was gone. It had sunk in the night, struck by something in the dark water, gone beneath the surface in less than an hour. He was left on a rubber raft 6 feet across. No engine. No radio. No way to tell anyone where he was. The nearest land was more than 800 miles away. Between him and that land, open ocean, unpredictable weather, and water too deep in places to reach the bottom with 3 kilometers of rope. He had food for 1 week. Water for 3 days. He survived for 76. In the history of solo ocean survival, no one had lasted longer on a life raft. Not before 1982. Not since. Steven Callahan's account remains, more than 40 years later, the longest documented case of its kind, studied by the United States Navy, read by survival instructors, and cited in maritime safety training around the world. He did not survive because he was extraordinary. He survived because of what he did, every single day, when doing almost nothing would have been easier. This is what those 76 days actually looked like. Atlantic in January. The North Atlantic in January is not a place that announces its danger. It does not need to. The ocean at that latitude, in that season, operates on its own terms, indifferent to the vessels that cross it, indifferent to the people inside them. The water temperature hovers near the surface at roughly 18 degrees Celsius in the subtropical zones, dropping sharply further north. The swells move in long, slow progressions, built over thousands of miles of open fetch. There is no coastline nearby to interrupt them. There is no shallow shelf to slow them down. The Canary Islands sit at the eastern edge of this crossing, a volcanic archipelago off the northwest coast of Africa, used for centuries as a departure point by sailors heading west. The trade winds blow steadily from the northeast here, reliable and consistent. They have guided ships across the Atlantic for as long as ships have made the crossing. Sailors know them. They trust them. From the Canaries, the nearest landfall to the west is more than 2,700 miles away. In late January of 1982, that expanse of open ocean was empty in every direction that mattered. Shipping lanes existed, but traffic was sparse. The water was deep, in places, more than 3,000 meters beneath the surface. There were no islands, no reefs, no visible markers of any kind between one side and the other. It was, by most practical measures, one of the more isolated stretches of ocean on Earth. A small sloop had recently departed from these waters, heading west. It would not arrive. Callahan was 30 years old in 1982. He was an American sailor and boat designer, not a hobbyist, not an adventurer in the casual sense, but a man who had built his understanding of the sea through years of practical, deliberate experience. He had designed and constructed his own vessel, a 21-foot sloop he named Napoleon Solo. The boat was small by ocean crossing standards, but it was his. He understood its structure in the way that only a builder can, not simply as a thing to be operated, but as a system of decisions, each one made by his own hand. He had sailed across the Atlantic before. The ocean was not unfamiliar to him. In the summer of 1981, Callahan entered the Mini-Transat, a solo transatlantic sailing race that departs from France and finishes in the Caribbean. It is a demanding event. The boats are small, the route is long, and the sailors compete alone. Callahan did not finish the race. Napoleon Solo was damaged in a collision during the early stages, and he was forced to withdraw. He brought the boat to England for repairs, spent several months there, and prepared to make the crossing again, this time not as a competitor, but on his own terms. He departed from El Hierro, the westernmost of the Canary Islands, on January 29, 1982. His destination was Antigua, in the Caribbean. The plan was straightforward: follow the trade winds west, maintain a steady course, and cover the distance in several weeks. It was the kind of passage that experienced sailors make regularly. The route is well documented. The winds are known. The hazards, while real, are manageable for someone with Callahan's background. He carried provisions appropriate for a solo ocean crossing. He had food and water for several weeks, navigational equipment, safety gear, and the knowledge to use all of it. He had also, as part of his standard equipment, an APIRB, an emergency position indicating radio beacon, and a 6-person inflatable life raft manufactured by Avon. The raft was packed in a canister and stored aboard the boat. It was there as a precaution. Most precautions, most of the time, go unused. The first days of the passage were unremarkable. The trade winds held. The boat moved well. Callahan maintained his course and settled into the rhythms of solo sailing, short sleep intervals, regular checks of the rigging and sails, careful monitoring of his position. Solo sailing at sea requires a particular kind of discipline. There is no one to share the watch, no one to take over when fatigue accumulates. The sailor becomes, in a functional sense, part of the boat's operating system. Attention cannot be fully suspended. He was approximately 800 miles west of the Canary Islands when conditions changed. The exact nature of what happened next has been documented through Callahan's own account, published in his 1986 book Adrift, 76 Days Lost at Sea. It is one of the most detailed first-hand records of open ocean survival ever written. Callahan kept notes during his time at sea, and those notes formed the basis of a reconstruction that is unusually precise for an incident of this kind. What is known is that sometime during the night of February 4th or 5th, 1982, the historical record places the event in that window, something struck or compromised the hull of Napoleon Solo. The boat began to take on water. The cause of the hull failure has never been definitively established. Callahan's account suggests a collision, most likely with a whale, though he could not confirm this in the darkness. What he could confirm was the result. A hole had opened in the hull of Napoleon Solo, below the waterline, on the port side. The water came in fast. In a 21-foot boat, fast means very fast. There is almost no interior volume to absorb the intrusion. The boat begins to lose its relationship with the surface almost immediately. It was the middle of the night. Callahan was alone. He attempted to locate and plug the breach. In the darkness, in a flooding cabin, with water rising around him, he worked to find the source and respond to it. He could not stop it. The hole was too large, the water too forceful, the conditions too disorienting. At some point, and this point arrives quickly in a vessel of that size, the decision to abandon ship is no longer a choice. It is simply what must happen next. He gathered what he could. His survival equipment, his emergency pack, flares, a sleeping bag, some food and water. He deployed the Avon life raft, inflating it alongside the sinking boat. He transferred himself and his supplies onto it in the darkness, in open ocean, 800 miles from the nearest land. Napoleon Solo stayed afloat for some time after Callahan boarded the raft, long enough that he was able to return to it briefly to retrieve additional supplies. Then the boat went under. He was left on a circular rubber raft, approximately 6 feet in diameter, in the middle of the North Atlantic. The date was February 5, 1982. He had enough water for a few days. He had enough food for perhaps a week. He had no means of propulsion. He had no way to communicate his position. The trade winds that had carried him west would continue to carry him west, but the destination had changed entirely. There was only ocean now, in every direction. The Avon life raft that Steven Callahan boarded in the early hours of February 5 was designed for emergency use. It was not designed for extended habitation. It was circular, roughly 6 feet across, with an inflatable tube forming its perimeter and a low canopy that could be partially closed against wind and spray. The floor was also inflatable, a thin membrane of rubber separating Callahan from several thousand meters of water. The raft had been packed and sealed before the voyage, as is standard practice, and had inflated correctly when deployed. In those first moments, that was the only thing working in his favor. The interior space was extremely limited. A man of average height could not lie fully extended. There was no standing room. Movement was constrained entirely to shifting between sitting and lying positions, navigating around the equipment he had managed to bring aboard. Everything was wet. The canopy reduced wind exposure but also reduced ventilation. Salt accumulated on every surface. Callahan conducted an inventory of his supplies in the first hours after the sinking. What he had was modest. He had a sleeping bag, now wet, which would retain some insulating value. He had several pounds of food, some canned goods, some emergency rations. He had approximately 8 pints of water. He had a spear gun with 3 spears. He had a hand-operated desalination pump, known as a solar still, a device that uses solar energy to evaporate seawater and collect the resulting freshwater condensation. He had flares, both handheld and aerial. He had a knife. He had a signaling mirror. He had navigational charts, a compass, and a copy of Bowditch, the standard American navigational reference. He had a logbook, and he began using it almost immediately. Within the first few days, Callahan established a clear understanding of his most pressing problems. Water was the first. The human body can survive weeks without food, but dehydration becomes critical within days. His initial supply of 8 pints would not last long under the physical and psychological demands of open ocean survival. The solar still became, from the earliest stage, the centerpiece of his daily routine. He deployed it carefully each morning, positioning it to maximize sun exposure, checking its seals, monitoring its output. On good days, with strong sunlight and calm conditions, it produced close to a pint of fresh water. On overcast days, production dropped significantly. He supplemented this with rainwater when it came, using every available container to collect it. Food was the second problem, and here the spear gun became critical. The waters of the North Atlantic, even in the open ocean, are not lifeless. Callahan's raft, like any floating object at sea, began almost immediately to accumulate its own small ecosystem. Triggerfish appeared first, drawn to the shadow of the raft and the organisms that gathered beneath it. Dorado, also known as mahi-mahi, followed. These fish would become his primary food source for the duration of his time at sea. Spearing fish from a small, unstable rubber raft in open ocean is technically difficult. The raft moved constantly. The fish were fast and unpredictable. A missed shot meant a lost spear, and he had only 3. He developed his technique carefully, learning the behavior of the fish around him, waiting for the right moment, conserving his shots. He retrieved spears when he could, diving into the water briefly alongside the raft. He also improvised. Using materials salvaged from Napoleon Solo and components of the raft's own equipment, he constructed additional tools, a longer spear, a more effective collection system for rainwater, patches for areas of the raft showing early signs of wear. His background as a boat designer gave him an unusually practical relationship with materials and structural problems. He did not simply endure his circumstances. He worked within them, consistently and methodically. He tracked everything in his logbook. Food consumed, water produced, weather conditions, his estimated position, the state of the raft and its equipment. The log served a dual purpose. It was a navigational and survival record, but it also imposed structure on days that might otherwise have dissolved into formless waiting. Structure, under those conditions, was not a comfort. It was a tool. World days at sea, alone on a raft, do not pass the way days pass on land. There is no external structure to mark them, no schedule imposed from outside, no other people to create rhythm, no change of environment to signal the movement of time. The sun rises and sets. The swells continue. The wind shifts occasionally but does not stop. Without deliberate effort, time on the raft could become a single, undifferentiated experience, an erosion rather than a passage. Callahan understood this risk. He imposed structure on his days deliberately and consistently. Mornings began with the solar still. He checked it, adjusted it, recorded its output. He assessed the state of the raft, the inflation of its tubes, the condition of its canopy, the integrity of its floor. He checked for chafing, for slow leaks, for any sign of deterioration in the materials. He logged the weather and his estimated position. These were not lengthy tasks, but they were real ones, and they gave the early part of each day a defined purpose. Fishing occupied a significant portion of his waking hours. The fish around the raft were not always catchable, conditions, light, and the behavior of the school all affected what was possible on any given day. But Callahan approached fishing as work rather than opportunity. He observed the patterns of the fish, the times of day when they moved closer to the surface, the way they responded to shadow and movement. He became, over weeks, a more efficient hunter than he had been at the start. He read. He had managed to bring aboard a copy of Bowditch, and he worked through it during the long hours when fishing was not possible. He also used the navigational charts to track his position as accurately as he could, plotting the drift of the raft against the known patterns of current and wind in that part of the ocean. He also simply looked at the sea. This is documented in his account without elaboration, and it requires none. A person alone on the ocean for weeks develops a relationship with their environment that is difficult to describe in functional terms. The water, the sky, the behavior of birds, the movement of clouds, these became, for Callahan, a form of information as much as a form of experience. He was reading the ocean the way a person reads a landscape they have come to know intimately. The raft continued west. The days continued to accumulate. By the end of February, he had been at sea for more than 3 weeks. Food from the ocean is not simply a matter of catching it. It must be processed, rationed, and consumed in a way that accounts for the body's specific needs under survival conditions. Callahan understood that raw fish, while far from ideal, provided not only protein but also a measurable quantity of fluid, a fact that mattered enormously given the limitations of his water supply. He consumed the flesh, the eyes, and the fluid from the spine. He wasted as little as possible. Every part of every fish he caught was evaluated for what it could provide. The dorado that gathered beneath the raft were large fish, capable of providing significant nutrition when caught. But they were also strong and fast, and landing one from a 6-foot rubber platform required both accuracy and physical effort. A strike that wounded a large fish without killing it could result in a struggle that damaged the raft or lost the spear. Callahan was careful. He selected his shots, waited for proximity and angle, and struck with precision when the conditions were right. He lost spears despite this care. Retrieval was not always possible. By the midpoint of his time at sea, his equipment had degraded through repeated use, and he had made repairs and modifications to extend its functionality as far as the available materials would allow. The triggerfish presented a different problem. They were smaller and more numerous than the dorado, and they had developed the habit of gnawing at the underside of the raft, at the fabric and the inflation valves. Callahan fought them consistently, stabbing at them through the raft's floor when he could detect their activity, but they were persistent. The damage they caused was slow and cumulative. He caught fish on most days. Not every day, and not always enough, but consistently enough to sustain a caloric intake that kept him functional. His weight declined steadily throughout the voyage. He was aware of this. He documented it. The raft moved west. The fish continued to gather beneath it. And beneath the fish, the ocean continued, without interruption, to an unimaginable depth. By the 5th week, the raft was deteriorating in ways that could no longer be managed through routine maintenance. The triggerfish damage to the underside had been ongoing since the earliest days of the voyage, but its effects became critical in mid-March. One of the raft's inflation chambers, the outer tube that formed its primary buoyancy, developed a slow leak that Callahan could not fully seal. He had repair materials, and he used them. The patches held partially, but the leak was not stopped. It was slowed. Each day, he pumped air back into the tube to maintain its shape. Each day, the pump cycle became a fixed and exhausting addition to his routine. The floor of the raft, that thin membrane between Callahan and the open ocean, also showed increasing signs of stress. The constant movement of the sea, the weight of a man and his equipment, the slow work of saltwater on rubber over weeks, all of it accumulated. He reinforced what he could. He redistributed weight to reduce pressure on the most vulnerable areas. He monitored the floor with the same attention he gave to the inflation tubes. His body was also failing, in the gradual, measurable way that prolonged deprivation produces. He had lost a significant amount of weight by this point. Estimates based on his own account suggest he lost roughly a third of his body weight over the course of the voyage. His physical strength had diminished. Tasks that had been manageable in the first weeks required more effort now. Fishing, pumping the raft, managing equipment in rough weather, each of these demanded more from a body that had less to give. He had also had several encounters with ships. This is among the most documented and painful aspects of his account. On multiple occasions during his 76 days at sea, Callahan spotted vessels close enough to attempt signaling. He used his flares. He used his signaling mirror. On at least one occasion, a ship passed close enough that he believed he had been seen. It had not stopped. Whether the signals went unnoticed or were seen and disregarded, he could not know. The ships disappeared over the horizon, and the ocean returned to its previous silence. Each missed rescue recalibrated his understanding of his situation. He was not simply waiting to be found. He was adrift in a part of the ocean where the probability of a passing vessel seeing a 6-foot orange raft, from a distance, in open water, was extremely small. He continued. There was nothing else to do. On April 21, 1982, 76 days after Napoleon Solo went under, a group of fishermen operating near the island of Marie-Galante, a small island southeast of Guadeloupe in the eastern Caribbean, spotted something in the water. It was an orange raft, low in the water, its outer tube partially deflated. Birds had been circling it. The fishermen investigated. They found Steven Callahan aboard. He was alive. He had drifted approximately 1,800 miles from the point where his boat sank, carried by the north equatorial current and the trade winds, the same forces that had been moving him, without pause, since February. He was taken ashore at Marie-Galante. He was severely malnourished and dehydrated. He had lost approximately 1/3 of his body weight. His legs were covered in sores from prolonged saltwater exposure. He required medical attention, which he received. He had survived 76 days alone at sea on a life raft, the longest such documented solo survival at the time. He was conscious when they found him. Remained Steven Callahan returned to the sea. In the years following his rescue, he continued to sail, to design boats, and to write. His account, Adrift, 76 Days Lost at Sea, was published in 1986 and remains one of the most precise and unsentimental records of human survival ever documented. It has been in print continuously since its release. What his story demonstrates is not extraordinary willpower or exceptional courage in the dramatic sense. It demonstrates something quieter and more transferable, that survival, extended over weeks and months, is largely a function of structure, attention, and the willingness to continue working when work produces very little. The ocean does not change for the people who cross it. They change for it.